Good morning, everybody, and welcome along to this edition of LiR Confidential on lirmedia.tv. And our usual email is info@lirmedia.tv for all your comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel by pressing the red button on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, my special guest this morning is Robert Collins. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks for having me.
And Robert is lecturing in history in UL, is it?
Yeah.
Now, for our viewers, Robert, where did you grow up and how did you get into the history eventually? How did you come to be from way back to now, you know?
Yeah, it's a bit of a long story, so bear with me, but it's hopefully interesting. So I'm from Limerick in County Clare originally, so just on the border with Limerick, so between Limerick and Clare. And so I grew up there, went to primary school in Limerick, and then I went to St. Munstan's College for secondary school, so that might be familiar to some viewers, big rugby school, obviously. And although I didn't play much rugby myself, I got injured playing my first match ever playing rugby in first year in school, so gave it up then. Played soccer instead. But so I had a secondary school history teacher, Mr. Tim Kennedy, who I found at the time because of that, history became my favorite subject in secondary school. So then I decided I would study it in the University of Limerick in 2011. So I did history and politics in UL for 4 years. Preferred the history to the politics side of it. And I had one particular lecturer, Ruan O'Donnell, who subsequently became my PhD supervisor, and I guess I'd call him a friend now. But I took a couple of modules with him in Irish history, and at the time he did two. He still does. He does two modules. He does one on the kind of War of Independence, Civil War, that time period, and then he does a special module on the kind of Northern Ireland Troubles. And from that module, I became really interested in Bloody Sunday, particularly in 1972, but then also the hunger strikes in 1980 and 81. So then I decided, so then I did my final year project, which you have to do in your final year of your undergraduate in Bloody Sunday, and from there became more interested in the topic. And I actually have a funny story about if you'd like to hear about how I ended up doing a PhD.
Yeah.
It was, I didn't even really know, being honest, I didn't really know what a PhD was and that kind of stuff. And I just sound silly, but I thought only people who were scientists and stuff did PhDs. So I didn't realize you could do one in history. And I was going out for a pint after one of my politics classes with the class, the lecturer at the time. We were all going for a drink afterwards in the Scholars, which is one of the two bars in the university, 3 bars. And Ruan, who I knew from the lecture, and I had spoken to him about my project and stuff, but he wasn't my supervisor for my project, and he was having a pint on his own reading a newspaper, and I just went over to say hi to him because I was finishing up university, and at that time I thought I wanted to do secondary school teaching, so I was planning for that. And I got chatting to him for a couple of minutes, and from that he just said to me, "Jesus, you seem very interested in the topic. Would you be interested in doing research in it?" And I didn't really know how that worked or anything like that. And he said, "I'll meet you next week." So a total chance meeting with Ruan in that bar, and I ended up doing a PhD out of it. So it wasn't like I knew I wanted to be a doctor in history from when I was a kid or anything like that. It was a pure chance meeting, and then took it from there.
Well, I guess, Robert, I suppose the easiest thing for anyone like myself or anyone else is if you love the subject and you're in love with your subject, really, I don't mean to be blasé about this hard work involved, but it is a little bit easier when you have an actual love for history and for all things. And research, I dare say, becomes easier. Of course, it's difficult, because where do I start, what do I do, and all of that thing. But once you get into it and you have an interest, steps follow along then, and it'll probably take its own journey eventually. No, I don't know anything about doing research or anything like that.
I think it's fun on there.
I always had a love of history anyway, reading and all of that. But what brought you down the road then of looking at specifically NORAID and the 25 years span that there'll be a book coming out early next year on that anyway?
Yeah. February is the date I kind of agreed with the publisher, but I'd be optimistic. Maybe we might even stretch it to January, but we'll see. But yeah, so again, from the final year project on Bloody Sunday. So what I decided to do, because obviously Bloody Sunday is a topic that has been researched a lot. I mean, there's a lot of books written about it and stuff. So for the final year project, it wasn't like I had to produce something entirely original, but I had to kind of take a new angle for it. So I decided to look at international responses. So look at how different countries covered it, and that sort of thing. So one of the areas then became the United States, obviously with such a large Irish population. So that was when I first heard of NORAD. I'd never heard of them before that stage. So then that was when I kind of got interested, and then I was kind of like, there seems to be a lot of support or a lot of interest in America particularly. So then I was like, who's pushing this, and who are the people that are involved in NORAD? Are they people from Northern Ireland? Or, I was just really getting into it that way. So it kind of went from there then, because then when I spoke to Ruan about doing a project on originally it was we were going to look at just Bloody Sunday, but then he said, why don't you, we both kind of hashed it out, and I kind of said, look, I'm really interested in NORAD, and he said, well, why don't you look at NORAD in more detail? And to be honest with you, Pat, I assumed that there had been lots of books written about NORAD, because I was like, if they're the main kind of group in America who are helping to finance the kind of Republican movement in Ireland, I just assumed, well, I'll just pick up a book about NORAD and I'll read it, and then something will come from it. And then I realized that there hadn't been an academic book really ever written solely about NORAD. So then that was kind of, I guess, where the idea kind of blossomed that I would do it.
Right, Robert, because an awful lot of detail. I know people think that everything and anything has been written about Northern Ireland,
Yeah.
And you're dead right there. I only know about it because I was alive at the time, and I was there myself. I would be aware of that. But a lot of people, as you said, there's no academic thesis done on NORAD, Of course, there's a huge connection with the Irish and Ireland. Anyway, we're going way back to the 1840s for financial support and support with guns and support with all of that, And provisional IRA obviously were becoming very prominent that time in 69, 70, 71 that you're talking about. And of course, then compound the whole thing, Brian, the British, of course, never learned from history, specifically in Ireland, made a big boo again, Brian Faulkner, when he introduced internment.
Yeah.
And that pushed huge amounts of people into the Republican support side, I'm not saying they wouldn't have joined up or done, but it really divided the community right down the middle then. That act alone, really. I suppose we shouldn't be too blasé about it either, because in Ireland, just only my own opinion, I know what you think of as a historian, we have the Special Criminal Court here in Ireland, which you can be put away for life on the word of a chief superintendent. I mean, that is something that maybe historians could look at as well, because I think it's shocking to have that on our books. But that's my personal opinion. The Special Criminal Court, I think it's something akin to internment. That's all. I know what you think of that.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah, and I'll talk about internment, I guess, in a second. But I think what's interesting is I actually recently read a book, which I'd actually recommend to any of your listeners. Marissa McGlinchey, Dr. Marissa McGlinchey, she wrote a book about dissident Irish republicanism. And I think that's a topic a lot of people maybe don't really know a whole lot about kind of republicanism in the post-Good Friday Agreement kind of context. And one of the issues that I found that with the interviewees she spoke to, was about the no jury courts, and about how that was one of the issues that kind of still inspires a lot of the dissident groups now. The idea that you could, like the idea of political prisoner status and special criminal courts and that sort of thing is still, it's interesting. It's still an issue that resonates with I guess Irish Republicans and also some interested people, the general public, to this day. So I would tend to agree with you when you say that it's an interesting issue that kind of 40 years on from, or 50 years on even, from internment, that are still, we're still surprised that we're seeing those types of measures appearing in Ireland.
Yeah, and it is. I think we should be grown up more as a republic. We should grow up now, and throw off the last remnants of these things. That's only my own opinion for what it's worth, But now, you your research into NORAID, and that was for people who don't know what that is. Well, they'll have to read your book when it comes out next year. Lads, we'll have
Yeah.
to read the book. But before then, you can look it up yourself. So it's mainly the fundraising arm to assist the Republican movement in Northern Ireland, for the want of a better word. And of course, there was huge publicity when Joe Cahill, who was the provisional array leader at the time, he went to America, but he knew he wouldn't be getting in.
Yeah.
He went to America and he was arrested in, as you know, at the airport in JFK. Huge headlines around, you know, fulfilled its function, really, you know.
Yeah, and I think. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, and I think what came interesting out of that incident, of course, as well, was that that became a very common theme throughout the entire conflict. Like, one of the main issues when I interview either former members of NORAID or Irish Americans, that they talk about is the notion of visa denial, visa censorship. It's one of the, when you lead on to, of course, in '92, it's one of the famous quotes that President Bill Clinton gives in an Irish American forum in '92 when he talks about giving a visa to Gerry Adams. It kind of became the hotbed issue in the '90s, but even as early as 1971, you have situations where, and as you said, Joe Cahill probably realistically knew, given the publicity, him appearing at a press conference a couple of days after the introduction of internment and stuff like that, probably suggested he wasn't going to get in. But in Joe Cahill's book, which I think was ghostwritten by Brendan Anderson, there was a quote that Cahill included from one of the founding members of NORAID, Jack McCarthy, who said, when Joe Cahill contacted him through his attorney or whatever, and they spoke about, and Cahill said that he just wanted the matter resolved and that he just wanted to get home to Ireland, and Jack McCarthy said to him, "No, we want you to stay in prison because you're worth $500,000 to us a day in publicity while you're in prison." Showed exactly kind of how kind of NORAID were kind of trying to capitalize on the publicity of internment, and obviously having a figure that could almost represent internment in America because he was being detained was obviously very valuable to them, even though, as you said, it was probably unlikely he was ever really going to get in. But
no, I know that. And of course, on the other hand, then you had, of course, I'm just trying to think who was in power time as Fianna Fáil, and then 73 to 77, the coalition government came into power with Labour and Fine Gael, and the Cosgrave government. But getting back to yourself, Robert, did you get a chance at all to speak to Bernadette McAlasky?
I haven't yet. I did cover a bit. I did cover a little bit in the book. There is a little bit about her tour of the United States in '69 after the Battle of the Bogsign. She comes to the States and it ends up being a bit of a ill-fated tour. It doesn't quite. I haven't had a chance to speak to her yet about that, but she does have an autobiography that she wrote at the time that I read, which I find useful. But sometimes it is useful to get kind of the contemporary kind of perspectives.
I met her twice at a different fora of people at different events, but just socially, it's all just socially.
Yeah.
She was a fantastic speaker. Of course, she was elected an MEP. She was very young. She was only 20, I think, 19 or 20.
Yeah.
She was elected an MEP, you know, but a lot of people have been involved. My special guest this morning on LiR Confidential is Robert Collins, and he's covering the whole issue of NORAID, which was the fundraising arm for the Republican movement in the 70s right up to the 90s. Now, Robert, of course, there was an awful lot of people, both politicians and all, supporting NORAID. We shouldn't forget it wasn't in the vacuum. There was an awful lot of goodwill towards the movement, and particularly that then was highlighted when they brought in internment without trial. You know, when Brian Faulkner brought in that really, I think that really shone a light on the injustices that were perpetrated against the community in 6 counties. And particularly, I'm thinking Senator Ted Kennedy was very vociferous, and a few more as well, Tip Cahill, a few more in their own Congress over. And so that really, I think, put pressure on the British government, although it took them a long time to get rid of internment, you know.
It's an interesting. You take the nail on the head there. I think internment is the big kind of turning point, because I know in the summer of 1970, for example, you have the Falls Road curfew, so you have the curfew being imposed, but that doesn't seem to resonate in America as much as internment does, because I remember speaking to some people who were involved in NORAID in the early days, and they said that they noticed a sizable difference when they were speaking to people, that suddenly there was a lot of people were in favour of civil rights, and the idea of improved rights for the nationalist community. But suddenly when you're advertising, or when you're fundraising or publicising the notion that people are being arrested for what would be perceived as no reason other than being a nationalist, or a Catholic, then that seemed to resonate in America. And I touched on it a little bit on the very short article I wrote, but there's a lot more in the book. But you can see that and it's not just necessarily the fundraising, it's a lot of people who then join NORAID, because NORAID never, for our listeners, they become a very important organization, but they never necessarily gain huge membership. But there tends to be a surge every time a major event happens in Ireland, because that's when maybe it's being broadcast on television, it's being discussed in the Irish communities in America, particularly on the East Coast, and then that's kind of when you see the upsurge in support. So internment is definitely, and obviously, Pat, you'd know, but obviously internment is so big in a turning point in the conflict itself, but also I think in America it's probably the first major incident that leads directly to not just to money obviously coming in, but also to a lot of people who, particularly as I said, older members of NORAID from the early days, would all tend to point to internment, and obviously Bloody Sunday, which comes out of internment, as the reason they joined.
And then, of course, down here in the Republic, we brought in this Offences Against the State Act, which was cracked anyway, because particularly if you lived around the border counties to the 6 counties, you could pick up anyone on BBC, on radio, on television. You're further down like ourselves. You only, the internet, of course, was non-existent. We had no internet, so we had to rely on radio and television and newspapers. But I think that was that really, I think that really had a very negative effect on the community, both South and 6 counties. Something that we could look into sometime about what we call the Offences Against the State Act. I mean, when you look at internment and all of that, and you look today, I mean, one of the proposals, I hope we won't go through, like, if you're after having the experimental vaccine, you can go into the pub now and have a pint and a steak. I'll have to stand outside looking in the window at you.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a slippery slope that we could step into, where you create an unintended consequence of trying to do the right thing, And we have many of those laws now coming in on a temporary basis, and I think it's sad in my book anyway. I don't know what you think about it yourself.
Yeah, but particularly when you talk about internment, I think the really interesting thing about internment is that I think Faulkner and his government believed, and that's according to the cabinet meeting they would have had a couple of days before it was brought in around the 3rd or 4th of August, was that they thought that internment would come in across the border as well, across the 26 counties. And obviously, because it didn't, because Jack Lynch, I guess, and Fianna Fáil government weren't very receptive to the idea of internment, because it worked so well in the border campaign in the 50s, in the 56-62 with the border campaign, that there was internment across the board. I think, and
the Irish politicians were very. I mean, people should remember it's only 50 years after our own civil war here, when there was an awful lot of atrocities on both sides. And that there was an awful lot of those people and relations of those people in power in our government in the 60s and 70s, so that, and some of them actual figures who participated. And so therefore, you could understand why they would be very, very careful of that and wary of. I mean, the idea of picking up people off the street and throwing them into prison, locking them up and saying nothing was something you'd only read about in communist China or somewhere like that,
Yeah, and it was just it turned out that it was badly organised in 1971, and the problem was that and a lot of the stuff that's been written about it is that probably by 73, 74, the British government and British Army had their intelligence awful lot more improved, so they were interning, I guess, the quote unquote right people. But at that stage, the damage had already been done, because they had already picked up thousands of people who hadn't, and I guess for a lot of them, particularly young men, probably turned them into IRA volunteers by interning them. So you have a situation where, unfortunately, if the policy doesn't work, and it's similar, I guess, going back to what you're talking about now with the current policy of the government, is if the policy doesn't work in its immediacy, it might be effective a couple of weeks or months after that. But if it doesn't, if at its inception, if it turns out to be a disaster, nobody will remember that it worked later, because I know after the ceasefire, I think it's the 74 ceasefire, if I'm correct, with internment, the British Army were very successful in picking up provisional IRA volunteers. But at that stage, internment had already been labelled such a disaster, and obviously Bloody Sunday had come out of it with the anti-internment march. So you have a situation where, because they didn't have the correct intelligence at the start and they didn't have the cross-border cooperation, once it was a disaster at the start, it was always going to be a disaster, regardless of whether it would prove fruitful later on. So there's no doubt that because they didn't have the right intelligence, etc., at the start, internment just became an unbelievably strong rallying cry for provisional IRA. Because as you said, if you turn on, say, to young men and young women in the 6 counties, basically you're going to be arrested regardless, just because of where you live or because of your religion or belief. Then people are going to join. I mean, people are going to naturally join because they want to be able to protect their families, etc. So internment became almost, as I said, well, not almost, became just such a rallying cry for provisional IRA and in America as well.
It was a huge recruiting arm for the provisional IRA movement at the time, the internment I'm talking about. But also ourselves, when we were off duty, I know around the border counties, we had a list of premises, pubs mainly, and that we couldn't go into because we were in the army, and for security, we had a whole list of things. I mean, we were laughing at it at the time, but when you look back, it was a strange time living in the Republic of Ireland. The time was very strange. We couldn't go across the border. We had friends, but we used to meet the British Army at checkpoints. They were only young lads like ourselves, you know. They were on one side of the road, we were on the other side of the road, exchanging fags or whatever, and having a chat, you know. And at human levels, it was very, very stressful and very sad in a way, you know. At human level, just whatever about the uniform, whatever about the politics of the thing, we were just young lads at both sides of the border looking at each other, you know, wondering, in the name of God, what are we doing here, you know? You know, so that was. Now, Norway was very important, all right, as you said. Norway was very important to the Republican movement, and it allowed figures later on. I think it allowed people from the Republican movement who were trying to politicize the thing rather than figures like Adams, Johnny Adams, who our history show interviewed Johnny Adams recently, the history show Limerick.
I caught a bit of it actually.
And Johnny was just general at the time, but Johnny is Johnny. I interviewed him years ago, you know. It's tough. But I think he's one of the heroic figures of Northern Ireland, irrespective of your politics, you know. People like him, people like John Hume, people like Martin McGuinness, particularly people who had been involved in the armed conflict. I mean, Adams was shot 3 times. There was 3 different attempts on his life, you know. So really, it wasn't all caviar and you know, you know. So people like that. But getting back to your own research, anything else interesting, Robert? You yourself, as you said, you weren't even born in at the time you're writing about, you know.
Yeah.
How was it for you yourself as an Irishman here living in the Republic, discovering things about, particularly the forgotten massacre of Ballymurphy? Came into that focus recently, you know, and it's a shocking indictment that the British Empire itself, it repeats the same carry on no matter what country they went into, killing people for killing's sake, no matter what country they went into, you know, and they never learned from history. When it came to Northern Ireland as well, the pattern was the same. Did that resonate with you, or did you delve much into that?
Yeah, good question. Just to go back to your first one about it is quite I guess, I don't know if unusual, I guess, but it was interesting for me because I didn't think when I kind of started, like I had an open mind when I started, I guess, because I didn't know a whole lot about NORAID, but I was very surprised to learn about so many incidents that I guess I didn't learn about in school, if that makes sense. I guess I was learning an awful lot about the history of Northern Ireland and the conflict, and even going back, and I was learning, and I felt as though I shouldn't have necessarily been learning some of this information for the first time, but I found that I was, which I guess was unusual. I think when you touch on NORAID, I think what I try to do so much with my research is that NORAID are obviously a organisation who have been accused by lots of different government organisations, etc., of financing gun running operations and various members and stuff like that. But kind of with the book tended to, I do write about that, and I do write about that there's a famous trial in New York in 1982 involving one of NORAD's founding members, Michael Flannery. A really interesting case, which I can talk about in a couple of minutes. But what I found was I really wanted to concentrate on the kind of political aspect, and you mentioned it there, which I think was really useful, is that as the Republican movement in Ireland became more politicized kind of in the post-1981 hunger strike period, the same thing happens in America. But I wanted to really concentrate my research on not necessarily getting bogged down by the details of various accusations that are made against NORAD or whatever. I just wanted to kind of get an understanding of who are these people, why are they getting involved? Because there is kind of there's potentially an accusation we have in Ireland that we say, well, the Americans or Irish Americans are just very misguided. They don't know a lot about Ireland, so they just support it because they have Irish heritage and they think we just support anything which has something to do with Ireland. Whereas I found myself more and more talking to people who were very clued in, some of which were born in Ireland, were raised in Ireland, who were very knowledgeable about Irish history, much more so maybe than a lot of even Irish people. And then it kind of took me from there. So I really wanted to look at, well, why are these people getting involved? I mean, like, for example, they're probably NORAD's most famous member, I would say, Martin Galvin, who I've had an opportunity to interview a couple of times. Like, he was a barrister and an attorney and a district attorney in New York. So, like, he's obviously a well-educated, well-spoken person. So to just dismiss him as this purveyor of terrorism or the supporter a blind supporter of the armed struggle, I just wanted to get an understanding of, well, why are these types of people supporting it? And then the political aspect, as you said there, they didn't just raise money, they produced a newspaper, they did a lot of publicity, that kind of stuff. So I really wanted to kind of delve into that angle of it, because they're raising a lot of awareness. But really, to be honest, Pat, and without spoiling the book for people, I would say that kind of the main point I took from it was that all NORAD did really in America was capitalize on blunders or major atrocities that were carried out by British security forces, and vice versa. When the provisional IRA carried out attacks and civilians were killed, support for NORAD dropped. But they just capitalized. So they just capitalized on Bloody Sunday 1972. They have a huge surge in 1981 and 1881 with the hunger strikes with Bobby Sands and the 10 hunger strikers. So they're just capitalizing. So they're not doing anything necessarily. And as you said, going back even as far as the 1798 rebellion and the emigration that started after that, really Irish America is just capitalizing on what's happening in Ireland in order to raise money. And the same thing happened in the 70s and 80s. And regardless of whether maybe some of the listeners would have heard of NORAD, probably potentially if they're living in the Republic of Ireland like myself, they would be an organization that might be the object of derision. But really, I just wanted to understand, why are these people, so many people, supporting them, giving them money? Is it just blind support for anything to do with Ireland or anything that's anti-British, or is there something more intricate, I guess, at play? And I think I found that as I started to speak to more people and started to research it a bit more. So I would say, to answer your overall question, I would say I was very surprised when I went to archives and stuff like that to learn about a lot of incidents, which kind of helped in a way, because it meant that it was an organic process when I was researching the PhD, that I didn't have my 5 or 6 chapters for my thesis set out before I started, and then I just wrote about them. Like, to be honest, a number of the chapters I wrote about and that they feature in the book are about events or organizations I'd actually never even heard of before I started the PhD. So that was an advantage. But I guess I was surprised that I was learning about an awful lot about, I guess, the history of my own country that I had never learned about in school, even though I'd studied history in secondary school and in college. So if that's the case, then people who don't study history, for example, in college or university or in secondary school are learning even less. So it was quite surprising. I enjoyed it, but I guess on another level, I'd like more to be done in schools to teach us about what is a very recent and very important conflict.
You're dead right, Rob, because I mean, I grew up in North Cork in a rural area, and I didn't know anything about my local history till I was an adult, and we were passing these places, walking to school every day. And I think that's where it starts in the beginning, when you're walking to school, or there should be walking tours for the kids, particularly in urban settings where that house over there was owned by so-and-so in so-and-so, and that plaque over there is, things about ourselves, our own sense of local history. And that's where the building blocks then begin, in my opinion. And there should be a lot more emphasis on local history in the beginning, well, you know, in your environment around you, and then you can spread it out after that if you like, you know.
Yeah.
But now you yourself, the central figures, of course, as you said, some of the central figures, movers and shakers in America, were belittled in our media and were just scorned and dismissed, as you said, as dreamers and misguided people. But they were not. They were
Yeah.
probably more aware of Irish history. Many of them were as informed as any historian could be about Ireland. In fact, more informed than an awful lot of the journalists who wrote on it, who wrote on them, at the time. Just go back and look at the articles.
Yeah.
And I think myself that a movement like that, an organization like that, I think it had the effect. I know it's a stupid thing to say at this remove. It had the effect of pushing the movement eventually into a political space that they have to occupy, away from the violence. I know it took a long time. That was the sad
Yeah.
part about it, but an awful lot of impediments were put in the way as well, both from our own governments down here as well. We weren't innocent bystanders, so to speak, down in the
Yeah.
Republic to the struggle in the north.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting point you make about as I delve more into, as I said, is that, like, for example, just to give you an example, is that the four named, there were a couple in the background, but the four named founding members of NORAD in 1970 all fought in the Irish Civil War, and in the War of Independence. So, particularly Flannery, who fought in Tipperary in one of the flying columns, and was interned in
Colin.
22, I think, during the Civil War. He was anti-treaty. So, like, these are all Irish-born, Irish-raised people who obviously moved to America in the kind of 26 to 29 period, in the kind of post-Civil War period. They moved to the United States and became naturalized American citizens, got jobs, and then, but always stayed interested in Irish history. So I think maybe in the post-81 hunger strikes, you have a lot more of an influx of maybe just interested Americans into it, because obviously Bobby Sands and 1981 becomes such an international event that everybody becomes almost interested in Irish history around the world, just because of what's happening, and it's become so publicized. But, like, it was one of the things I didn't know before I started, but just it's interesting is that, like, a lot of the particularly early years of NORAD, they're all people who were born and raised in Ireland. So whatever you think about them, as whether you think they should be supporting the armed struggle, whether you personally supported it or whatever, to just label them as these Irish or Americans who don't know anything about Ireland, who left Ireland 50 years ago and haven't heard about Ireland since, and just happen to have an Irish passport or whatever. Like, these people are people who fought through the Revolutionary War in Ireland, and obviously then just become involved because of what's happening in Northern Ireland. So I think that was one of the things I kind of wanted to get from the book, was to just understand.
There's another dimension to this, because I was reading, I'm fascinated with the American Civil War myself. I've been reading a lot more recently on it, so just as a hobby. And quite a few of the Irish people who fled the country just after our own Civil War had met some of the veterans of the American Civil War in the United States. And as we know, an awful lot of Irish fought on both sides of that. So there was that revolutionary link as well, that appreciation of the struggle like that, in general, in both sides. And as you said, they weren't just flag waving Kumali, dancing at the crossroads and all that. They were serious people who had a serious grasp of the situation. And it's a pity that some of our politicians didn't have their same energy and the same interest in solving the problem, And I think the hunger strike in 81, was another utter sad disaster, sad, I suppose, historical happening that, it still resonates today. I've met some of the families of the hunger strikers many times at different functions in 6 counties, and it's still raw today, And of course, we have that link going all the way back to Terence McSweeney, who made international headlines. The international press suddenly stood up and took notice of Ireland in Terence McSweeney's case when he died on hunger strike. That made international news, which was really put the British Empire a small bit on the back foot at the time, And then, of course, the other Lord Mayor, was shot dead. The second Lord Mayor was shot dead,
yeah.
which really, Thomas McCurtain, who was actually a relation of my own mother,
Okay.
she was O'Mahony, but we have that. But anyway, that's by the way. Getting back to the weapon of the hunger strike, I mean, we were watching this almost on television unfolding day by day. I couldn't, I still, but that drove an awful lot of young people back into activism of a violent nature in provisional area. That really prolonged the agony and the suffering, I think, myself on this island, anyway, looking back on it, you know.
Yeah, and it's just interesting for me, I guess, as somebody who didn't live through it, just to look back at it and kind of speak to people. Like, one thing I find really interesting, Pat, and I'll be honest, is when I interview a lot of people who were involved with Norway, where they all point to the hunger strikes as the moment where they may have had a passing interest, but it was the hunger strike in '81 that really turned them, because a lot of them said to me that there's these young men who are willing to die, starve themselves to death, and then for what? And then they wanted to find out what was. I mean, what are they? What like, because it's such a horrific ordeal. Why are they willing to go through that, and how bad must the situation be for people to be willing to do that? And I think, as you said, it resonates so. Which is why probably it resonated so much, I guess, in America as well as Ireland. And as you said, it leads, obviously, as we know from our history, it leads obviously to the politicization of the Republican movement, because obviously Bobby Sands becomes elected as an MP, but it's so interesting for me, because the hunger strike, I think there's almost halfway through the book, there's almost such a turning point in the way that there's people involved in the 70s who are very much hardened Irish Republicans, even in America. A lot of them were anti-treaty in the 20s, are people who became involved in Norway because they've always maybe had this anti-British sentiment, this kind of desire to see a united Ireland. But in '81, you have an influx of a lot of American-born activists, a lot of people who are just maybe had a passing interest in Irish history, but now all of a sudden want to get involved in the cause. So you have, it's probably, I would say, outside of, I think it's the biggest turning point in America during the conflict. Bloody Sunday is maybe the biggest event at the time, maybe raises the most money. But I would say '81 becomes the turning point where all of a sudden you have, as you said, as you rightly pointed out, you have an influx then of more kind of people who wouldn't have been as interested in Irish history before it, and then they're the people who really push Norway to move more towards a political end to the conflict, because obviously you have founding members like Flannery who grew up knowing the armed struggle, believe in the armed struggle, believe that the only way to get Britain out of Ireland is, but these newer members who join are more thinking, well, can we put political pressure on Britain? Can we get Congress involved? There was a tendency to get Congress involved in the 70s, but outside of individual politicians like Ted Kennedy mentioned, or others, Mario Biaggi is a big one, Italian, in New York and the Bronx, but you have a push post '81 in Ireland, and then it's very much translated into America. You have these new activists who are joining, who are saying, can we put political pressure? And then ultimately, as you said, probably it took too long, but that's kind of where it's born out of in America. And it's a huge turning point in Norway's history, because now you have them allowing an awful lot more members to join, and then an awful lot more maybe politically conscious members who are saying, can we reach out to our local congressman or woman? Can we and you start to see more type of political protest maybe, as opposed to fundraising events.
There was huge marches that time. I remember in Cork City, I was living in Cork City at the time, and I remember going down to one of them. I could not get over. I mean, I wasn't surprised, but I'm just saying I was surprised really at the numbers. But people shouldn't forget that in '98, when the hunger strike was on, an awful lot of people, even of my own age, people I knew personally, gave up their jobs, packed up their lot, and went off up to the 6 counties and joined up, as I say, participated in the struggle, for the want of a better description. And as I said, Fianna Fáil were in power most of the time. Fianna Fáil, of course, were the Republican Party in the Republic. They were known, but the Republican Party became very, very small in their posters as time went by. But nevertheless, I mean, I was surprised, because you had figures like Cahill, Boland, and those people who were in power at the time of the hunger strikers, and they would be, you know, they were involved in the famous arms trial in 1970,
Yeah, of course, yeah.
and they were in power at the time. You would think that they would put all their might together to solve this. There's another thesis there on that, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
And in my opinion, why they stood idly by in many cases. But anyway, look, there we go.
Yeah.
My special guest is Robert Collins on LiR Confidential, and tell our friends about us. And Robert's book on that whole history of Norway will be out on early in next year, Robert, I presume. But
Yeah.
we will certainly look forward to that. And for people, for any historian worth their salt, it's as you said, it's surprising that so little has been done academically on that whole era, you know, and the effect it had on. Now, when you speak to people, I mean, you generally you teach, I presume, Irish history.
Well, in the way it works in the University of Limerick is, to be honest, is when with myself is it's kind of whatever classes are available, to be honest, Pat. So I haven't been able to get a full-time post there. So
Yeah.
I have taught Irish history, but I also end up teaching really anything really to
I know my friend,
whatever I kind of get given.
my friend involved me as a PhD as well. She's taken blocks of lecturing jobs as well, lecturing.
Yeah.
So slightly related to her PhD, like in your case, slightly related, but you have to work, you have to feed yourself and pay the bills.
Yeah, I haven't really been given an opportunity to teach a full class on NORAD yet, but I'd like that in the future.
Yeah, and what way is Irish history taught? How did you find it yourself in university?
Varied. I think I would say that I was surprised a little bit that I would say that I did more. I would say over the course of the 4 years, I did more modules on topics not related to Irish history than topics related to Irish history. But that, to be fair, is generally, my perception would be, that's dependent on what lecturers you have available to you. So in the University of Limerick, so like Ruan, who obviously again was my supervisor for the PhD, and a friend, would be the only modern Irish historian in UL. So if you wanted to learn about modern Irish history, when I say modern, I mean 1800 to present day, he would really be the only lecturer who would specialise in that. So I mean, if he's available to lecture that class, obviously he lectures it, but if he isn't, I guess they have to offer something else. So I would say my perception would always be that I'm very passionate about Irish history and would like it to be taught more in schools, secondary school, and then leading into university, because I think it's taught as one of a number of subjects in your secondary school syllabus. So therefore, I think there isn't the same interest by the time they get to university in Irish history, if that makes sense. So as you said there, Pat, I think is that people's interest in history is kind of inspired locally, and then they decide. So I find when I'm having conversations with people about Irish history, about history in general, the people who tend to be the most knowledgeable about it are not people who studied it in school. They're people who took an interest in it,
Right.
maybe later in life, or just because of a local event, and then they started researching Irish history themselves. So I would say, I don't know, I don't have all the answers, you know, and I'm not in power or anything, but I would say we probably need to do a little better job of inspiring people to get interested in Irish history, and maybe something like you said there, maybe making them do projects at university or secondary school level in local history would maybe inspire them, as opposed to giving them a mandated curriculum that you have to teach about this, you have to teach about that. Maybe a system where you say, because one of the things that, in fairness, the class I did with Ruan, which was great, was that he let us pick our own project to do within the remit of the module, let's say. But we were able to pick our own project to write about, and I felt as though the standard of papers, that, because I took that class and then actually graded with him on that class, and I felt as though the standard of the work from the students was an awful lot better when you allowed them to take an interest in a particular area themselves. So I think if we did more about that on that, and I think it would inspire more people to do history, because ultimately everybody's interested in history. I think most people I meet, when I tell them I'm studying history, they kind of say, "Oh, I love history, but I don't really know a whole lot about it," or whatever. Whereas I think,
because in my generation, we were going to school, our history finished in 1916.
Okay, yeah.
So ironically speaking, teachers who were teaching me in national school had been involved in the Civil War, some of them going to school. So we had that connection, but that's the way it was. And I think I spoke to Pat Coogan there a couple of months back, and I hope to have a second. He wasn't well for a while, so I hope to have a second interview with him soon. but Tim Pat is a character.
Yeah,
He's straightforward, but he, like you, like the way history is taught and the segments. No, he doesn't have much time for the way it's segmented. You know
yeah,
that it's this compartmentalized, so to speak.
yeah,
You know, as you said, you look at the breadth of you can't discuss 1916 in a vacuum. You can't discuss it
yeah.
discussing the lockout, discussing 1903 and going way back and where the IRB and all that. So you know that I don't have to say that to you. So that's what he was talking about to me, and speaking
Yeah,
about
I think
now.
it's I just not to interrupt, but I think I just recently taught a module in UL to a group of mature students, which I really enjoyed actually. But one of the things I had to kind of teach them is, as you just mentioned there, really well, was that one of the things that we kind of have to, that because of the way it's taught in schools when we move into maybe universities, is trying to tell them that history doesn't work in time periods. Like it's not like the people who lived in that time, woke up one day and all of a sudden they were living in a different time period. Everything is so we tend to study history in blocks. We tend to say, okay, we'll take a time period, let's say the Irish famine, and we'll
Yes,
just study the Irish famine, but you can't study the Irish famine without studying the history before the famine or the history after the famine, but we have a tendency to
yeah,
compartmentalize time periods where we say, okay, we're going to teach a class on Ireland from 1700 to 1750, but like you can't teach that without teaching what happened before 1700 or what happened after 1750. Otherwise, because the history of Ireland, you can't just to do
I
it that
know.
way. So I think
It's
I know it's difficult to do, but I think getting students out of the habit of viewing history as a series of time periods would be helpful. I think if we stop
you
viewing
look.
history that way.
It would be like you look at CNN, Fox News, BBC, even RT. How many times you see homeless people on your screen? Never, I'd say.
Yeah,
To be like learning social history without showing the pictures of reality of life. I don't know. That's only my own opinion on it.
yeah,
And as you said, Robert, history today, people. I think it's a shame that it's a bit done down in a couple of years. But I think there's like the Limerick Historical Society, who are doing a show with us every
yeah,
couple of weeks, and they're doing and all the historical societies, out here in Shannon where I live, they're keeping a huge interest in history and local history, producing the journals and the historical. I don't have to say that to you anyway. I'm sure you're well familiar with them, And the
yeah,
walking tours that Limerick Historical Society conduct around town has been fantastic. I mean, since I came to live in the area, I've learned so much just walking
yeah,
around Limerick City, and those walking tours has been just fantastic. Like the connection with the American Civil War and the Tate clothing factory. You know,
yeah,
I never knew they made the uniforms of the Confederate and the Union Army and for Napoleon's armies. You know what I mean? I
yeah,
never, I never knew that till I came to Limerick. I went around on the walking tour. So, as you said, walking around town should be a feature of both national school and secondary school at least once a week. Going around once a day for one of their classes and looking at the historical points around town and pointing out to them who lived here and who lived there and all of that. Now, Robert, you're looking forward, of course. Getting work is a struggle for an awful lot of people today,
yeah,
particularly in the pandemic and the thing we're in, and particularly with the fact that you don't have like we're conducting this. We have a studio, but sure, nobody can come into it. Like we're
yeah,
conducting our programs on Zoom, which has been a blessing for us to keep going. We only started operating in January 2020, and then we were closed down in March. Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
So
yeah,
been a huge struggle. But anyway, look, we'll do the best we can. But it's not the same as having face to face with each other. You have a different dynamic, but you learn to adapt, I suppose. And it's the same, I suppose, with education. An awful lot of stuff is done online, but that's very antiseptic, isn't it?
yeah. And I think maybe part of I agree. Yeah, obviously, I've been doing some teaching online for the last year. I think part of maybe potentially the problem coming out of this is that I think it's worked maybe better than I had anticipated when I first started, because obviously it because it hit in March. Well, obviously we had to go online from being in person, and I think I always felt as though the students were okay with that because they thought it was temporary, and then obviously it became And I think the online teaching suits some students, but I think the problem is that I don't think we should interpret the success of stuff like Zoom, and even for yourselves, as you mentioned there, and the success of being able to do video conferencing. We use Microsoft Teams, they use Microsoft Teams in UL, and that
Yeah.
sort of thing, as something that we should do all of the time, because I think there was maybe a tolerance among students and lecturers that,
Yeah.
look, we're going through a global pandemic, we have to be understanding, we have to adapt. But I think there's no substitute for the in-person teaching and that angle of it, because I don't feel as though I feel as though part of my role as a lecturer or somebody who's interested in history is to kind of hopefully inspire other students to get interested in history. I think that's very difficult to do 1 hour a week over Zoom, because you're not getting the class starts, you do the class, and then the class finishes. There's no real opportunity for them to have a discussion with them about their interests, about anything like that, which I would normally do in an in-person environment. So
it's the little chats. Yeah, it's the little chats and small group lecture and the little huddle in the thing, and 2 or 3 people coming up and engaging. All of that is social aspect is very much missing. But will that be back? I wonder this year. Will that be back in the next?
They're talking about face-to-face teaching in September in UL. I don't think right now. I don't think I'm not sure I'll be in UL in September, to be honest, because I'm not sure there's anything going. I think that's probably the case across the board with a lot of the universities. I think so. It will be a struggle for me. It is a struggle right now to find something more permanent. I think because I'm only a year removed from getting my PhD, so like there's people ahead of me in the queue, I suppose. So I do kind of have to bide my time a bit.
I've learned through my friend without mentioning your name, I've learned that academia is a very small place in the Republic of Ireland, very small community, and opportunities are smaller still. And it's like many jobs. I'm a retired civil servant, so I know the score, I know how things work, and it can be any teaching job, whether it's in university or secondary school or anything. On the one hand, you hear sometimes we're very short of teachers. On the other hand, people like yourself, I've met lots of other teachers who are out of work, and you have these headlines, and the truth don't make sense to me. We're short of teachers, and you meet teachers working in different jobs, they can't get a job. I don't know.
I think in fairness for academia, I think I'm very fortunate. I think that I kind of stumbled into it, as I said at the start, and now I realize that I love it. So there's nothing else I really want to do. So I'm willing to maybe, I have a higher tolerance level for all the rejection, because I can tell you, Pat, in academia, you get a lot of rejection emails for a lot of things, and you just.
I've seen my friends as well, my friends.
Yeah. So you kind of like, I'm okay with it because I know it's what I want to do, but I can understand. I see a lot of colleagues, friends of mine in academia on Twitter particularly, who are saying, "Oh no, I'm done with academia. I'm taking a job somewhere else." Probably, I mean, if I'm on, you know what I mean, if I don't find something soon enough-ish, I'll try and start looking into other areas. But I think academia is very much one of those professions. I found anyway, and I say this to students, I say you have to be passionate about what you're doing, because if you're not, it will kick you where it hurts a lot. And as long as you're willing to tolerate that in the short term, you know that something will eventually come up for me and for anybody who's doing it, but you will have to deal with a lot of rejection. So I would say to anybody interested in academia, pursue it, but have thick skin, I would say, because you may have no idea, as you said there, because it's a small place, you may have no idea why you were rejected. So you may have just been rejected because they already had somebody else lined up to take that position. So that's what I tell myself anyway. But you have to kind of be familiar with, you have to understand that when you get into something like this, because as you said at the start, with research and the stuff I'm doing, like I love being able to, even just last week I did, like, and I'm sure that's why you do it. I love being able to interview people who lived through that time period, hear their stories. Like 95% of the stuff, like the things they tell me or whatever, isn't necessarily relevant to what I'm researching, but I just love listening to them tell me about their experiences of being in Northern Ireland, their experiences of growing up, and all that kind of stuff. So because I love it, it makes it easier to tolerate to tolerate kind of the constant instability. But
social history of the time as well, because I interviewed a chap recently. Well, he's not a chap; he's probably my own vintage, but he wrote a book on one of the figures of the Civil War. But we intended talking about his book and in Civil War, but Ned Daly, it was Ned Daly. He wrote a book on Ned Daly, but we spoke about the whole social fabric of the time of where you lived, where you grew up, and all that. It was fascinating, but it's not just the figure; it's the stories, how they lived, how they escaped, how they got a lot of network of people. I suppose looking after them in the community, you know, and hiding them and all of that. So it was all those stories and the different families and different characters. But Robert, I tell you, we're over an hour talking, and I'll tell you one thing about yourself: your enthusiasm and your love for your craft came across very well. And
Thank you.
all I can do is wish you the very best, and hopefully, fingers crossed, something good. But we look forward to the book. But we'll catch up with you again soon, anyway. No doubt about it.
Yeah,
Have
yeah, I'd love to come on in around the time the book is coming out or whatever,
no doubt about it. You know.
and chat a little bit more about it. Because I appreciate you guys reaching out to me. And
Yeah,
as I said, I'll talk about this stuff with anybody who listens. So I appreciate you listening.
So in the meantime, just drop us an email, because we're happy to do it, because we'll put the time aside and do it anyway, you know, because anybody local, you know, and from this edition of LiR Confidential with my special guest Robert Collins, and don't forget, you can I think you can look him up anyway, because I find him, he's on social media, and Robert will be his book. What is the title of it here?
No Raid and the Northern Ireland Troubles, 1970 1998.
Norrie and Northern Troubles, yeah, 1970, 1994, whatever. But that will be coming out in the new year. And but before then, we catch up with you again, Robert. And I said, I wish you the very best and hope things will work out for you. And from this edition of LiR Confidential LiR Media, until we meet again, Robert, good day and take care.
Thanks very much.